This happened when I was around 9 years old. I'm 25 now, and it's something I'll never forget. It still gives me goosebumps to this day. I live in a terraced house, and my neighbors and I have our own little patio. There's a small road 10 meters from my yard where people do their Sunday walks on. Only a small fence separates my small yard and a patio from that road. I live in a pretty crowded area with several of these terraced houses spread around in my neighborhood. So seeing people walking on that road is pretty normal for me. Seeing random people standing on my patio is not. When I was 9, I usually got home from school about an hour before my mom got home from work. I lived maybe 50 meters away from my school, so my mom figured I was mature enough to be home alone. It was only an hour or so before she got home. So this one day, I got home from school. I did the usual thing, which was to make sure that I locked the front door and double check that the back door leading to the patio was also locked. Then I rushed up to my room upstairs to play as much PlayStation as possible before my mom came home and would make me do my homework. While playing, I heard this noise coming from outside my window. It was kind of like the sound of a cat, but my cat had been missing for over 3 months. A hope sparked within me, and I thought, oh my god, did he finally come back? I ran downstairs to check if it actually was my cat. The sight that met me gives me goosebumps again just writing this. There's a guy standing on my patio, a very tall man with black hair covering half of his eyes, making him look like a male version of the Ring Woman or something. I could hear him making this high-pitched sound, almost like a cat meowing. A brown liquid was running down from his mouth, and I could see him spitting out my dad's stomped cigarettes. He was actually eating from the ashtray. I was frozen, observing this. Eventually, I snapped out of it and screamed so loud that the man must have heard it. He didn't react, just kept eating from the ashtray outside. I ran upstairs to my room, locked the door, and called my mom, who then promptly called the cops. I've never been more terrified in my life. Laying in my bed, under my sheets, shivering with fear. As I continued to hear these high-pitched noises from that guy, eating cigarette stomps from the ashtray on my patio. Kind of blacked out for a moment, because the next thing I remember is the police arriving on the road by my yard. I hear them talking to the guy, saying stuff like, "Sir, what are you doing? Get over here or we will come down and arrest you," and so on. The man did not respond, but the high-pitched sounds was more frequent and got louder and louder. I then decided to look through the window, feeling safe that the cops were there now. I could see 2 police officers standing by my fence. I no longer saw the creepy man, however, because he was standing directly 1 story under me and out of my field of view. The police jumped the fence, and I remember hearing that creepy man screaming louder than I'd ever heard anything before. He charged the officer with full force, and he knocked the officer out cold. The male officer then immediately tased the guy, leaving him shaking on the ground, still screaming. The policeman struggled to keep him on the ground while putting handcuffs on him, but eventually he did. After a little while, he managed to wake up the police officer, who seemed to be badly hurt. He called for backup and an ambulance, and then he sees me standing in the window above him. The expression on my face must have been something else, because he just looked at me and said, "I sure hope you didn't see all that." Then I started to cry. By this time, neighbors started to arrive, wondering what the hell was going on. One of my neighbors, an elderly woman, made me come down. She took care of me until my mom came back home. The police then took the creepy guy with them in their car and left. But they promised they'd come back and talk to us about what had all happened. This is where my story takes an unexpected turn. The male police officer came back later that night and sat down with me and my mom to talk. He explained that the guy on my patio was actually diagnosed with severe autism. He had escaped from a facility where mentally challenged people lived. It was located around 5 kilometers where we lived. He explained that that guy had actually been living in my house 5 years ago, but then he'd been forced to move when his mom and his only caretaker died. Poor guy probably thought he was going to find his mom in my house. He missed the routines, and he missed living there with his mom. The police had to move him from the house that time 5 years ago, because he was extremely strong, and this was the reason he reacted the way he did when the police came that day. Still frightened, I told the police officer that they needed to make sure that this would never happen again, and he promised me that it wouldn't. After a few sleepless nights, my life kind of went back to normal, and the years went by and that man didn't come back. That was until 1 year ago. At this time, my mom and dad had moved out. I bought that house from them, and I'm still living there today. I was enjoying my morning coffee on the patio when I see this random guy stopping on the road by my fence. He just stood there, staring at me. I look at him and give him a nod, and then I hear it. Those same high-pitched noises. Holy shit. It's him. His hair had turned gray, but the high-pitched sounds made me realize who it was. My heart started racing, and I instantly remember the reason why he was back. I realized that he must have managed to escape again, but because I kept my cool a bit longer than when I was 9, I started to realize how sorry I actually felt for the guy. 16 years later, and he was back to look for his mom. I decided to carefully ask him if he wanted to come down to the patio. He instantly jumped the fence. I started to think maybe he would knock me out like he did to that one police officer. He didn't. He just smiled. He looked at me and smiled. I offered for him to sit down, and he didn't respond. I offered for him to come inside, and he just started laughing. So we ended up going inside. His face lit up, pure joy. He was home. It reminded him of the life he had with his mother. It actually almost made me tear up. And all of a sudden he sat down on my couch, turned on my TV, and switched directly to the cartoons. I sat and observed him for a while. He was just completely focused on them. I wanted him to just enjoy the moment, so I didn't say anything. I realized I had to call that facility and let them know what was going on. The caretakers arrived 10 minutes later. After a lot of convincing, he got back up, crying, and went back to the facility. I called the facility 2 days later, and we made a deal. His name is Tom, and I now consider Tom my friend. Every Sunday from the day he returned, Tom and his caretakers visit me to watch cartoons. They tell me it's the highlight of his week. It makes my heart warm. Now, for several years, my thoughts were, let's not meet guy on my patio eating for the ashtray. Now my thoughts are, let's meet every Sunday to watch cartoons with my friend, Tom. My parents started leaving me and my sisters home alone when I was around 13 or 14. Of course, the rule was to not let anyone we didn't know into the house. One night, there was a knock at the door. I went to the door and tried to look out, but I couldn't see anything. We couldn't pretend that we weren't there because the lights and the TV were both on. I opened the front door a crack, thinking that the person would be behind the screen door, but that wasn't the case. There was a man in his late 20s or early 30s just standing in our doorway. I shut the door quickly and told him to get behind the screen door. He obliged, and I cracked the door. Yes, I wasn't very smart, and latched the screen door. He told me a story about his vehicle breaking down the road and needed to use a phone. I said that I couldn't see his car, and he indicated that it was further down the road. Then I asked him why he walked past 2 houses right next door, and then walked to the one with no car in the driveway. And I could see that he was becoming agitated. Here's a general recollection of that conversation. Look, are you gonna let me use the phone or not? No, my dad is sleeping, and I can't let you go into his room to use the phone. Okay, just bring the phone here, and I'll use it then. I'm not letting you in the house. Just bring the phone to the door. It won't reach. Please leave. Okay. I shut the door and lock it. And while my sister and I are talking about how scary that was, the side door handle begins to jiggle. That same man knocked and says, "Hey, will it reach this door?" At this point, I tell him to go to the neighbor's house and use their phone. And he starts to yell, "I bet your dad's not even home. Let me in. I want to talk to him." I told him, "Fine, I'll go get him." Then I went to my dad's room, got his shotgun, came out and racked it and said, "Here, meet my dad." The same man started cursing and calling me names, but he did leave. Or at least that's what I thought. He actually had gone around to another door and tried that one. Our dog, who was outside at the time, began barking at him. He proceeded to do something that made my dog yelp and cry out. I screamed out that I was calling the police, and he finally left. I felt really stupid for the entire interaction. I don't know if he was just a guy who needed a phone, but that whole experience was very creepy, and I was obviously ill-prepared for dealing with it at such a young age. This story happened to me back when I still lived at my parents' house. I was commuting to college at the time and had 3 siblings that also lived at home, my brother and 2 sisters. For some context, we lived on 5 acres in rural Ohio, surrounded on both sides by woods and farm fields. Additionally, during the week, my dad would normally leave for work around 2 a.m., so I always felt like it was my job to be the man of the house because he was gone during the times when you would imagine something sketchy happening. However, on this night, because it was the weekend, my dad was actually home. I woke up to the sound of my brother's voice trying to get my attention. We had separate rooms, but if you came out of our room, you could look down over the banister and see our front door. When I woke up, it took a few moments to get out of that haze and realize what was actually going on. I looked at the clock and it was around 2:30 a.m. My brother told me that there were 2 men at our front door. Now this really woke me up. We quietly walked out of my room to peek down and look down to the front door. When we looked, there was no one at the door, but I noticed my parents off to the side and out of view of the glass on that front door. I whispered down to my dad, and he told me that there were 2 guys who had been talking to one another and knocking at the door. Hearing my dad say this freaked me out even more. I went back into my room and grabbed my pistol, quickly shuffling down the stairs after looking to make sure that they were still not at the door. If they had been, they would have easily seen me coming down the stairs, as it's in direct view. My brother is right behind me as we head over to where my parents are, whispering to my parents to find out what was going on. Parents had awoken to the sound of our dog barking, only to find 2 men knocking loudly at the door. At this point, those 2 men returned and began knocking again. Despite the fact that no one had came to the door the first time, or that our dog was still actively barking at them, and also the fact that they were there at this time in the night, so late, and in a location where houses are spread out hundreds of yards away from each other. And again, knocking with the dog barking. It just made the situation even more terrifying. After a couple of minutes, the men walked away, and we all shuffled across the kitchen and into the family room to peek out those windows into our driveway. There was a black Cadillac sitting there, but no one was inside from what we could see. Immediately the question was, where did those guys go? They weren't in their car, and they were no longer at the front door. We would quickly get an answer to the question we just asked. All of a sudden, the handles to our back French door started jiggling, and they were actively trying to enter the back of our house, which entered into the kitchen. At this point, I just remember my mom frantically saying, "David," to my dad, as pure terror overwhelmed her. Then 2 things happened. Adrenaline filled my body as I prepared my handgun, horrified at the very real possibility that I might have to shoot these men. Secondly, my dad finally grabbed the phone and called the police and calmly told them what was happening. Thankfully, after a minute of jiggling, they stopped at the back door and disappeared once more, only soon to be back at the front door knocking once again. After a few minutes, we suddenly saw the local police fly up in multiple cruisers with their lights turned on. As they whipped into our driveway and into our front yard, the 2 men bolted and attempted to run the long way around the house across the driveway. One of them disappeared out of view, but the other one was intercepted by an officer yelling for him to get on the ground. He didn't. He was immediately tased and fell. A few of the other officers went around the house after the other guy, and one of them came to talk to my dad and I as we came outside. They ended up finding the other man hiding in my sister's little playhouse in the backyard. It appeared that both of them were either drunk and or high, as the one who hid had cocaine on him. While they were both arrested that night, we never did find out what they were charged with or what happened to them. Needless to say, that whole experience wasn't fun. So to the random men at our door in the middle of the night, let's not meet again. My family and I used to live in a very rough neighborhood when I was a kid, around 7 years old. One night, it was just my mom, me, and my 2 siblings at home. My dad was on a business trip. Around midnight that night, someone began to knock on our door. My mom woke up, went to the front door and asked who it was. No answer. She thought maybe it was some kids playing ding dong ditch or something, so she just casually didn't think much of it and went back to bed. About 30 minutes later, someone began to knock again. This time, she got up and peered through the side window to see if she could catch anyone out there, but there was nobody there. She starts to worry, goes back to the room, grabs my dad's shotgun, and sits in the living room in the dark, just waiting. Sure enough, a few moments later, someone began knocking again. This time, my mom shouts at whoever it is that she's going to call the cops, and if anyone tries to come inside, she would shoot them. Again, no response. My mom phoned the police, and around 2 a.m., they finally show up and do a quick search of the outside of our house while we all waited on the inside. After their search, they tell my mom that they'd found a piece of barbed wire about 4 feet long next to the front door, and they asked if it belonged to us. My mom told them that it wasn't hers and asked why. The police officer told her that it had to belong to whoever was knocking on the door then. He also told her he thinks that they were planning on strangling my mom with that barbed wire when she opened up the door to see who was knocking. Told her she was very smart to not open the door to see who's out there. Otherwise, it could have costed her life. They said they'd patrol the neighborhood until morning and do a thorough investigation once there was daylight outside. That next morning, as they were searching around the house, found footprints leading to the back of the house and leading up to my bedroom window. They'd also found nicks in the window sill, where they were trying to pry it open and break in, but had failed. Not long after that, we moved out of that house.
I worked at a 24/7 fast food restaurant a few years back when I was in college. The job wasn't fun or enjoyable in any way, and most of my coworkers were middle-aged people with no personalities. I was doing school online though, which meant I had more time to work, so I was cranking out 40 hours a week at least, and even got a promotion to shift lead after a few months. What I didn't realize when I took the promotion was that I was signing to officially be a full-time employee, which meant that they could make me work any shift. Not even a week into it, they put me as overnight, and I couldn't even argue it. Overnights were a pain in the ass because I'd be the only one there, so if the drive-thru got backed up, then I'd be hustling non-stop without any breaks. On the flip side though, sometimes it would be completely dead, and I'd just be standing around all night on my phone. This was one of those nights. I was in the back of the kitchen, sitting on a pile of boxes and scrolling through my phone, just trying to pass the time, when my headset rang to alert me that a customer was in the drive-thru. I got up and went to the computer, then asked what they would like to order. Nobody said anything, so I turned and looked up at the drive-thru camera, and the lane was empty. No cars in the drive-thru, or even in the parking lot around the restaurant. The system never really falsely beeps like that though. There was a slight storm outside, so I figured a raindrop or a flash of light must have tripped the sensor somehow. I stayed by the drive-thru window for a few minutes, and my headset beeped again. This time I quickly looked at the cameras and caught a man walking past the drive-thru lane. He was wearing a thick hoodie and a face covering, but quickly walked out of the camera's view. Where the restaurant was, there wasn't anywhere else he could have parked or walked from unless he was walking on the side of the main road. I watched the cameras to see if he'd come back, but after 10 minutes of no activity, I just went back to my phone. 15 more minutes went by before I got another beep, and when I checked the cameras, that same man was there, but this time he was standing in the drive-thru lane.
"Can I help you, sir?"
After a moment, he started reciting an order for a small meal. I wasn't supposed to serve people in the drive-thru unless they were in a vehicle, so I told him I couldn't accept his order. He stood there, letting the rain soak him as he just looked at the screen and didn't speak. I thought about telling him to leave, but I didn't want to escalate things if I didn't have to, so I just waited. After a minute, he started walking down the drive-thru lane toward the side of the restaurant where the window was. I rushed over and latched the window shut, and not even a second later, the man appeared outside. He had his hood and mask still on, but he looked to be in his late 40s and a dead look in his eyes. He watched me through the window and stood outside like he was waiting for me to talk to him. There was something about his look that really freaked me out and kept me from speaking. Then he softly said,
"Open up."
I nervously said no and just stayed where I was while the man continued looking at me. He asked again and knocked on the window, but after a few seconds, he turned, and as he walked away, a loud scraping sound ran along the side of the building. I checked the cameras to make sure he left, and luckily, he didn't come back. During the next hour of my shift, though, I was thinking about that scraping sound. I decided to take out the trash to the dumpster and take a quick look. On the side of the wall, under the drive-thru window, was a long scratch, looking like it was made from a knife dragging along the building. I called the police after that, but the man couldn't be identified from the grainy camera footage mixed with the heavy rain and fog. The man never turned up, and I'll never know exactly what he was planning on doing that night. But seeing as he had a knife ready in his hand, I assumed that if I had taken his order and opened that window, then that would have been the last thing I would have ever done.
Several years ago, I was in the midst of an awful divorce with my then husband, full of crazy allegations and typical angry filings centered around custody of our child. As with many divorces, friends and professional colleagues seem to pick one side or the other. In my case, there was one sort of professional contact who reached out to me after hearing about the divorce, who offered to be a witness for my case because of some experiences he related that I had been previously unaware of, regarding my ex's behavior out at networking events. So after this initial call, he started calling me on a semi-regular basis to make sure I was okay. This wasn't really someone I knew prior to the separation, and he was much older than I was, but claimed to have experience with divorce and custody, so I figured it was a good idea to be polite and not alienate him. My lawyer also told me that his testimony was important, so I kept things friendly, but I always had a weird feeling about him. A few months later, he called one day, and my son was very sick, and I told him I couldn't talk and explained why. He then offered to run to the store for me, which I honestly appreciated. But after that event, he kept dropping by uninvited, or he would stop by with cookies for my son. Again, I kept telling myself to keep things polite. The divorce is coming soon. Don't make this guy mad. During this time, he had also helped me set up a security cam system that my dad had mailed me. At one point, I needed someone to walk my dog, and he offered to do it. He used and returned a spare key the same day. One evening, he showed up while I was painting and insisted on sticking around to help, even though I was having my starting over catharsis and just wanted to do it alone. Not long after the painting day incident, he showed up unannounced and uninvited once again, having magazines with random decor saying, "We could finish decorating the house." And I was so weirded out that I made an excuse to leave. I then began ignoring his calls and took my son and dog to stay with my parents for several weeks to avoid these frequent drop-ins. I came home a few weeks later thinking he would have finally gotten the hint. It was a nice and quiet day. The following morning I took my son on an outing, and we both came back hot and tired. I put him down for a nap in my bed and decided I would close my eyes with him. I woke up maybe an hour or so later, and it took me a moment to realize that something was way off. As I'm blinking off the sleep, I realized there was a rose bush sitting on my bedside table that I definitely had not put there. There's a post-it note on it, something about planting it in the yard. I started shaking immediately. I recognized the handwriting and stood up to go splash some water in my face and decide whether or not to call my parents or the police. As I stepped into my bathroom, I realized that the mirror was covered in post-it notes, all with super creepy messages that were intended to be like love notes or with affection. But ultimately, all they did was scare me. I was still waking up trying to figure out how these notes could have gotten here. My front door was definitely locked, but as I went from room to room, there were notes everywhere. I mean hundreds of post-it notes covering the walls, in my cabinets. There was even one inside my coffee maker. I started grabbing them and putting them all into a pile when I got to the one in the kitchen that made my blood run cold. It said, "You're cute when you think no one is watching you." I then realized that there was a security camera pointed right at where that note was left. The one I had set up months earlier when I didn't think he was a psychopath. Called my parents in hysterics, sent them a bunch of photos, and my dad insisted I should not call the police. But he would drive over and change the locks and put a chain on the door. So we immediately changed the password on all the security cameras, which I had installed to document if my ex tried to break into the house. There were 4 in total, 1 on the front porch and 3 inside the house, including 1 inside my bedroom. This man could apparently see and hear everything going on inside my house for months. I realized he had just paid attention to my passwords when I was setting up the system. But the only way I can figure out that he got into my house is that he must have made a copy of my house key the day he had walked my dog. And because my dog had now gotten to know him, he wouldn't have barked to warn me, which also scared me. I was absolutely horrified. This man had been in my house for a very long time now. There's no way he could have put that many notes up quickly. And he was right next to my face and feet from my son while we were sleeping. And somehow, he thought that was okay. I left and stayed with my parents again for a few days, afraid of what he was going to do when he realized that he was now both physically and digitally locked out of my house. When I came home that night, my son was at his dad's, and I was home alone. So I got on the phone with another friend from out of town. At about 10 p.m., he shows up at the door pounding on it, trying the lock, screaming obscenities, and demanding to be let in his house. Gone were all the niceties. This was someone completely furious and derailed. All I could do was hide in my bedroom until he left. This happened on St. Patrick's Day, so I'm sure he'd been drinking. After that, there were several other times someone would start knocking on the door in the middle of the night, always when my son wasn't home. He tried reaching out using fake social media accounts several times, always getting blocked. Years later, I discovered that he had friended my mom on Facebook, and therefore was still able to see all the photos of us that she posted or shared. There was a huge argument when I saw she had left her computer logged in. A conversation they were having about me and how he could get back into my life. I sold that house 2 years later, still finding notes even as I was packing, and I am more than relieved that he no longer knows where I live. I do not post photos of my new house online. I've changed the privacy settings on all of my social media accounts. I avoid all the places he used to go, the network events he attended. I stay under the radar as much as I possibly can. Could never bring myself to play back the security camera videos because I was traumatized enough and didn't want to see just how much danger we were really in. Hopefully he never sees this post, but you know who you are. And I hope to God our paths don't cross again.
Two years ago, I was home alone in my house, watching it as my parents were away for the weekend. We lived in a normal suburban neighborhood, right outside of a major city. Well, of course, right as my parents left for the weekend, there was a crazy thunderstorm happening. I was actually getting alerts on my phone to not go outside and to stay indoors until the storm passes. I'm someone who loves thunderstorms. I usually make pizzas and watch horror movies as they rage on. And that's exactly what I was doing. I was upstairs in my room, watching Scream 4, when I suddenly got a text message. I was expecting it to be from my boyfriend, who unfortunately was working construction out in this horrible storm. But when I looked at my phone, I realized it wasn't from my boyfriend. It was from some random unknown number. Now, I usually ignore any messages I get from people I don't know, but for some reason, I was curious about this one. So I opened it up and read it. The text simply said, "Your back door is open." As I processed what the message was saying, I started to think, who could have sent this? Was it a next-door neighbor? But if it was, how would they know it's open? It was literally storming as hard as it was back during Noah's Ark. and I decided that I would go downstairs to check it out, just to make sure that it wasn't open. I entered my kitchen and looked at the back door. It was closed, and it even had the lock on it. I was kind of pissed off that I'd come all the way down here for nothing. I was about to go back upstairs when I got another text. It was from that same random unknown number. However, this time it said, "Too late, sweetie. I'm already inside your house." Now my heart was racing. I was in the kitchen and decided to grab one of the knives from the drawers. I started going around my whole house, checking the bathrooms, the basement, my parents' bedrooms, and everywhere. I searched the entire house, but I couldn't find anyone. I was starting to think this was some kind of prank when I entered my living room. I was doing a quick search when I noticed the window closest to our TV was slightly open, and underneath the windowsill were wet, muddy footprints that seemed to lead to the kitchen. I immediately ran into my bedroom with the knife and locked myself inside. I even pushed my bookcase in front of the door because I was so terrified. I called my dad, who told me to call the police right away. I did. Almost an hour later, a single cop showed up to my house in the raging storm, and he also did a complete search of my house and property. He also was not able to find anybody. This relieved me slightly. However, since there was nobody in the house, the officer was not able to do much. Thankfully, he sort of took pity on me and offered to sit in an unmarked car outside my house for the rest of the night. My parents came home the next day, and the first thing my dad did was he went out to the store and installed alarms and cameras around our house. Now, if there's ever a thunderstorm and I'm home alone, I always go to a friend's house or a family member's. I'm not taking any more chances. I work as a hairstylist up in a small town in New Jersey. I work for one of the major brands, and I love everything about my job. I was at work one day when out of nowhere, this massive thunderstorm came blowing through. Like it was bad. Trees were bending, shingles on roofs were blown away, and the worst part, the power in our salon had gone out. And without any power, we couldn't take any clients until it came back on. We tried to wait out the storm to see if it would pass soon and the power would come back on, but it never did. So our manager had no choice but to send everyone home early that day. Even though I only lived 5 minutes from the house, it took me almost an hour to get home because of the storm and the traffic. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I looked up at my house. My bedroom light was turned on, and I saw my husband walking around the bedroom. My husband has an office job, but he usually works way later than I do. As I watched his silhouette walk around our bedroom, I assumed that the power went out at his job, and he also had to come home early. But the weird part was, his car wasn't in the driveway. I found this very strange, but I figured there was some sort of logical explanation. Like, maybe he didn't feel comfortable driving in these dangerous conditions, and decided to Uber home instead. I sprinted into my house, trying not to get soaked, but still did anyway. I went right up to our bedroom to talk about the crazy storm and see how my husband's day was. I got to our bedroom door and opened it up. But when I did, standing in my room was not my husband. There was some other man with a bag stuffed full of our belongings and wearing some kind of warped pig mask. I actually almost had a heart attack. I screamed my head off as I realized this was actually an intruder. The man in the pig mask pointed a gun at me and told me to shut up. He stuffed my earrings and my watch into the bag, the gun still aimed at me, and then sprinted out the bedroom door. I watched as he bolted down the stairs, through the front door, and out into the storm. I cried for like 10 minutes before I could do anything. I called my husband and the police. It turns out, my husband was still at work, and his office still had power. I had to make a report to the police of everything that was stolen. The man got away with over $8,000 worth of stuff from us. I guess if I'm thankful for anything, it was the fact that the man did not kill me. It was just us two that night, and there was nothing stopping him from doing so. I thank God every day that I'm still here and alive on this earth. Also, the police have not caught this man, and I've read other news articles about people having home invasions in nearby counties, so he's still out there and at large. Don't be as stupid as I was, everyone, and please, stay safe. So, this story happened when I was a teenager, still living at my parents' house. We lived next door to an old man. I honestly can't remember his full name, so for this story, I'll just call him Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones wasn't married. He had no kids, no pets, and pretty much always kept to himself. He was our direct neighbor to the right side of our house. In all my years of living at my parents' house, I never had a problem or issue with him. But one night, there was this massive thunderstorm going on. One of those storms that just happens at 1 a.m. when you're already fast asleep. Well, this storm woke me up. Outside my window, it was flashing lightning, and heavy rain was smacking against my window. I remember the storm had woken me up, but I really had to go to the bathroom. And it was very late at this point. I can't remember the exact time, but definitely after midnight, because my parents were already asleep. I went to our bathroom, which was only right down the hall from my room. I did my business and was washing my hands when, for no reason in particular, I decided to look outside the window. Our bathroom window faced the backyard of Mr. Jones. I was just looking out into the night, admiring the storm that was going on, when I noticed something. I saw someone walking around in Mr. Jones' backyard, carrying what looked like this heavy black bag. I couldn't see too well because of the storm, but as I observed the man carrying the bag, I realized that it was Mr. Jones. First, this was extremely weird because it was nearly a hurricane outside. Second, Mr. Jones was about 75 at this point, so I had no idea what he was doing out this late in the middle of a storm. Since I was curious, I watched him as he moved to the direct center of his yard. He also had a shovel with him, and he started digging into the earth. This went on for some time, and I was amazed at how fast he was working in such shitty conditions. But that's when he grabbed the black bag and tossed it into the hole that he just dug. I remember this part so vividly, like a scene from a horror movie. A huge flash of lightning erupted into the sky, and at that exact moment, Mr. Jones looked up from the hole and saw me standing in the bathroom window watching him. I immediately turned off the lights and ran into my bedroom. I did not leave it for the rest of the night. The next morning, I remember going to my parents and telling them what I had saw last night. They pretty much dismissed any and all concerns that I had about what Mr. Jones could have possibly been doing that night. And get this, almost a year after that happened, Mr. Jones moved out of the house, but still owned it. He wouldn't sell it or allow anyone else to move into it. This was maybe 10 years ago, and I have no idea if Mr. Jones is even still alive or where he is. But what on earth was in that black bag that he was burying? And why the hell was he doing it in the dead of night during a massive thunderstorm? All of these questions have remained unanswered for my entire life. I live far away from my childhood house now, but I'm very curious what I would find if I went back and dug up that exact spot. I think it might be something that I'm not prepared to accept.
I want to tell this story to warn others. I, an 18-year-old female, live in Maryland, United States. I worked at a very popular burger restaurant. I work at the payment window, which is where I stand all night. I'm very friendly. I know sometimes a smile and a compliment can make someone's day a little bit better. Just the same night, before the creeper came, I had a customer tell me that I was so happy and she loved me for it. That gave me the courage and energy to survive this next interaction. I'm used to the awkward comments and stares from older men. I'm sure it's my friendliness that attracts them. Our uniforms are not very revealing. They think I'm naive. Maybe I am, a lot more than I thought, but I'm fully aware of the dangers of trafficking. This particular old man came through just before 6. He pretended not to hear his order, and then laughed like it was some sort of joke between two friends. This is not uncommon. It's an old man thing. No red flags yet. I tell him his total and he hands me all but the change, and when he does this, he waves the money around and makes me chase it. I was able to snatch the cash, but again, it was just some sort of old man thing, I thought, not concerned yet. He stared at the company name on my shirt and asked if this was my name. I don't wear a name tag for this reason. I joked that I was going to change my name permanently to that, and he perked up. At this point, I should state that he's some guy in his mid-60s to 70s driving a small white SUV with a kayak on top. He had some scruff on his face and was holding a phone to his ear this entire time. When I finally began to engage with him, he moved the phone to be facing me. Looking back, I believe that he was recording me. At no point did he speak into the phone or acknowledge it in any way. He probed with more pressing questions. Here's the thing. I have the same last name as someone from United States history. Most old people like talking about that kind of stuff, so I told him my last name. He didn't reflect or laugh. He just accepted and continued asking questions. And that's when I started to get this sort of sinking feeling. He still owed me change, and I told him, and he grabbed another dollar, and he handed it to me, but he wouldn't let go. He wanted to know my first name, and I dodged answering because I was getting creeped out. He wouldn't let go of the money and was practically drooling for more data and information about me. I gave him a name that I don't use, and he smiled, finally letting go. I got his change and told him to have a nice day. I then immediately left the window and told one of my coworkers about the weird experience. He returned just 2 hours later. I didn't recognize his car on the cameras until we got to my window. I hadn't thought too much about our interaction and was busy texting my dad about whether or not a chicken sandwich was a burger. My stomach dropped when I saw his face. I have many regulars, all of whom I'd have been happy to see. I hope he doesn't become one. I'll actually call the police. He smiled and said, "Hey, the one with the last name." I half smiled and wished for the days when we all wore masks. I tell him his total and he makes me chase the money again. For the entire time, he had his phone against his ear facing me. He starts asking even more intimate questions about me. I lie or dodge them best I can, giving him 0 correct answers, wanting our interaction to be as short as possible. Some of the questions he asked me: how often do you work? What time do you leave? How old are you? And for that one, I knew that he wouldn't leave without a number, and I had a nasty feeling the younger wouldn't be the better, so I said, probably 20s. And he joked about me being legal. I made a face and tried to get his change even faster. He asked if I had a boyfriend. I was getting more and more nervous, so my answers started getting more sarcastic. I told him boys were trouble. He specifically talked about himself and said that he'd treat me right. I handed him his change and told him to have a great night. He threw his hands in the air and was saying, "Don't be like that. I'll treat you right." I shut my window and said bye. He made a bit more of a fuss but eventually drove forward. For his question about when I got off work, I believe that he was watching the restaurant. I was shaking by this time and called my mom, and she immediately drove up. I talked to my manager and I was a little unsure of the car's colors, so he checked the camera for me. Shout out to my manager, he's the best. I continued at my window watching for the old guy, but I didn't see him again. I left an hour early and gave my manager specific instructions to not place a girl at my window, and he agreed. These interactions are unfortunately what cause formerly happy and cheerful service workers to become sour and quiet. I think I'll be taking a couple of days off. I'd already had another job lined up, and I'm excited to start there instead.
Some people are just crazy, and here's why. Back before I went to college, I worked part-time at Dunkin' Donuts. It was an easy job for the most part, but anytime you work in the public, you know the crazies come out. So I was working the morning shift. We open at 4, and believe it or not, we usually have a good amount of cars outside waiting. Well, I'm there, managing the register, when this lady comes in. Off the bat, I could tell that she was a little off. She came in staring at the walls and kind of speaking to herself. She came up to the register and ordered a large espresso. I rang her out and then gave her her coffee. She thanked me and then walked straight into our bathroom. Honestly, other than her being a bit off when she first walked in, she wasn't too bad. That was until we started hearing the noises. It sounded like clanking and things moving around after she went into the bathroom. I wanted to go in and check on the noise, but we started getting more customers and I got too busy to. Literally a half hour goes by, and I had almost forgotten that she even went in there, when she suddenly bolts out of the bathroom and straight through the front doors. I go into the bathroom to see what she was doing, and I absolutely couldn't believe what I found. This lady had completely disassembled one of our toilets, like it was unbolted from the ground and taken apart. I was so confused why the customer did this. That's when we had to get a plumber to come out and fix it, and you won't believe what they found. As the plumbers were trying to fix the pipes, they discovered something shoved deep inside of them. When they finally unclogged what it was, it turned out being a dead cat. And I hate to say this, but I think it was actually a kitten, because it was stuffed pretty deep inside the pipes. I almost threw up when I found out. We've given photos over to the police of her, and have made reports, but nothing has turned up yet. I have a feeling she was a local, and has a good chance of actually getting caught. But, like I said, people are crazy. I don't think I'll ever understand it. So, this lady and her daughter walk into my Dunkin' Donuts. They both order their drinks, and then head over to one of the tables to sit down and drink it. It's starting to pick up inside, and we're taking more and more orders, when the mom comes up to me at my side of the counter, butting in front of everyone, and asks me a question. She cuts me off as I'm talking to one of the customers, and says, "My daughter spilled her drink on her new shoes. We demand a refund." I was so pissed off at her for cutting me off that I almost lost my temper with her right then and there. I told her that we can make her a new cup of coffee for her daughter, when the lady cut me off again. She told me she wasn't talking about a refund for the coffee. She demanded a refund for the shoes. She started going off on how it was my fault that her daughter's shoes are now coffee stained. I couldn't believe this woman. She demanded to see my manager, and after he heard both sides of it, my manager had to inform her that we would replace the cost of the drink, but not the shoes. The lady grabbed her daughter by the hand and then screamed at the whole Dunkin' Donuts that we are a bunch of thieves and crooks. And believe me, I wish the story ended there. Well, a few hours go by after that incident, and it was time for me to go take my lunch. I was gonna head home real quick, heat up some pasta, and then head back to work. But as I walked to my car, which was in the back part of the parking lot, I stopped dead in my tracks. I could see, even from my distance, that my front car windows had been smashed in. I sprinted over and saw there was a note attached to one of the bricks that was smashed into my window. The note said, "You won't pay my daughter's shoes, then I'm not paying for your windows." I literally wanted to cry. I showed my manager, and everyone came out to see the damage. I had to call the police and make a report. I had to do that, and I'm out $700 for a new window. And the cops haven't even caught her yet, so she's still out there. I've had my fair share of crazies at Dunkin' Donuts, but she takes the top spot. This story happened a while ago, when I was like 19 and working for Dunkin' Donuts. I always used to work the night shifts. Our location was hit or miss sometimes. Our location is pretty isolated and backed by some woods that's just off the main road. Well, the night that I was working, we were dead. There was no customers in the parking lot, and the last one that we had in was maybe a half hour prior. Well, I'm just behind the register, looking at my phone, and I hear the door open. I looked up and saw this man walk in. He reminded me of someone who had just finished up from the gym. He had on this gray sweatshirt and gray baggy sweatpants. I noticed immediately that he was dripping with sweat, like he had looked like he had just run 5 miles. Then he saw me and gave me this really weird look. He was looking at me as if I was going to harm him or something. Even though he was extremely off, I didn't want to be rude and asked him how I could help him. That's when he started searching his whole body. He started dancing around and itching himself as if there was hundreds of fire ants crawling all on him. He started making these weird noises, and that's when I called for my manager to get up here because I did not know how to handle this situation at all. My manager stands next to me, and that's when the dude starts grabbing at the inside of his pants. For the briefest second, I could see that there was a gun in one of the pockets. And just as I realized this, the man full-on sprinted out of the store. Once I saw him dart into the woods, I ran to the front door and locked it. I told my manager I saw that he had a gun and to stay away from the windows. As me and my manager start to discuss what just happened, we heard this loud bang in the night. It sounded like a single gunshot going off. We didn't know if it came from that crazy guy or not, but we had no intentions of going outside to find out. After we heard the bang, we literally closed down early and left. And here's the crazy part. The next day, I read on social media a man in our area shooting himself by the lake that was right behind our Dunkin' Donuts. The post had a picture of the man, and it was the same guy who came into our Dunkin' Donuts freaking out the night before. The article said it was a gunshot-inflicted wound, and as sad as it is to say, I'm glad that it was only his life affected and nobody else's. I don't know what he was going through, because it almost seemed as if he was seeing something that wasn't there when he came into our Dunkin' that night. I no longer work there, and never will again in my life. At the height of the pandemic, my main source of income was DoorDash. I was let go from my sales job as profits plummeted, and there was a massive layoff. So, jobs like DoorDash and Uber Eats were what I had to do in order to pay my bills. Well, I usually worked at night. I felt it was calmer, and you tended to get bigger tips, because people were hungrier at these times. I picked up an order from this Italian restaurant, and based on the order size, it must have been for a large party of some sort. And mind you, this was about 10 p.m. at night on a Saturday. When I had finally arrived at the address that was on the order, I noticed I was delivering to this big mansion that was in the hills of our city. It honestly was very isolated, but whoever owned it had to easily be a multi-millionaire. Anyway, I get out of my car with the bags of food and head to the front door. Before I even take one step, I could hear music blasting from inside. In the windows, I could see people and strobe lights all moving around. My guess was right. It was definitely some kind of party. I walked up to the massive front door and knocked on it. The music was so loud that I didn't think they could hear me, so I knocked even harder. But no one came, and the door remained closed. About to just leave the food at the front door, I got a text from the customer saying, "Go around back, use the basement door." Pissed the hell off that they couldn't just open the front door, I dutifully followed the instructions and headed to the back. Mind you, it was very dark outside, and the clouds were covering the moon. I had to pretty much use my cell phone flashlight as guidance so I could actually see where I was going. Well, I get to the back, and it is much quieter here, and much darker. There were no lights on or party music. I saw a door slightly opened that I figured was the basement door, but I wasn't too sure. I took a step closer when I suddenly heard this whispering voice calling my name. It didn't come from the house or from the slightly open door. I turned around and saw this thick forest of trees nearby. I remember thinking if I wasn't crazy, someone had just whispered my name from the darkness of those trees. Very uneasy at this point, and praying to God that I was just hearing things in my head, I pulled out my phone and called the customer to let them know that I'm in the back. And that's when I heard this cell phone ringing, coming from the trees surrounding the house. Terrified, I heard the click on the other end of the phone as someone picked up. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, the voice that picked up whispered my name like I had heard just a minute ago. I literally said fuck this and left the food by the back door. I sprinted away from the dark trees and back to the front of the house where I parked. Now get this. I decided to look one last time in the windows and all the people partying. As I did so, I noticed that what I thought were people dancing in the windows were actually just cardboard cutouts. There were like 30 of them. It was the weirdest and creepiest thing that's ever happened to me. I got into my car and just peeled out. I put that specific address on a block so that I never have to deliver there again. I even reported the address to DoorDash. I now have a new job, one that doesn't require me to deliver large amounts of food to a psycho who lives in a mansion. And to all my fellow DoorDashers out there, please be safe. When this story took place, I had been working for DoorDash for a little over a year. Besides the crap tips, the job was simple. Drive to a restaurant, pick up food, deliver food, repeat. However, in this story, that was not my experience. I had received an order from this high-end restaurant we have in town. It was very popular, and I always had pickups there. Well, this address that I was supposed to be delivering to was on 13 Elm Street. Right there, I should have known that this was going to be a bad delivery, but I wasn't as superstitious as I am now. This pickup was at 11 at night. A bit late, but not unusual. I picked up the order and then followed my GPS to 13 Elm Street. The drive over was on the outskirts and in a more desolate part of the town. Like, there were trees and forest everywhere and hardly any houses. But after a 20-minute drive, the GPS said I had finally arrived. The house at number 13 Elm Street was this run-down, neglected property. There were boards covering the windows and weeds clinging to the sides of the house. The house looked creepy as shit under the glow of the moon, and I remember feeling like I was actually in a horror movie. I double-checked the address and confirmed that this was indeed the place. I parked my car in the gravel driveway and was telling myself that maybe the owners were doing renovations, and that's why the house looked this way. As I was reassuring myself, I pulled out my phone and started calling the customer to let them know that I was here with their order. But when I called, it went straight to voicemail. I'll be honest, this unsettled me a bit, but I was committed to the job and made my way up to the front door. I knocked, faintly at first, but then louder. There was no response. DoorDash's protocol at this point is to leave the food at the door and then take a picture. Just as I was about to take the picture, the door creaked open, revealing the darkness inside. And I mean darkness. I couldn't see anything and was praying to God it was the wind that accidentally blew it open. I was about to turn away when I heard this low, raspy voice coming from the darkness saying, "Bring it inside." I looked up, and in the faintest part of the darkness that I could see, I saw this woman. But not a normal woman. She looked at least 100 years old, had these ice blue eyes, and was wearing what looked like a bedsheet of some sort. I seriously thought my eyes were playing a trick on me. I tried to squint them and try to see if I couldn't see her, but she was there. In sheer horror, I left the food on the front steps and bolted back to my car. I drove off so fast into the night, with the old rundown house growing smaller in my rear view. The next day, out of pure curiosity, I googled the 13 Elm Street in my town. To my horror, I found out that property had been vacant for over 5 years. The last person to live in it was a woman by the name of Shirley Vaughn, who had died in that house at the age of 98. I ended up reporting this incident to DoorDash. They'd promised to investigate, but I haven't heard anything back from them. I have my theories, but I truly believe that I saw Shirley's ghost that night. Call me crazy, but it's what I believe. And if it wasn't a ghost, then I'm not sure what I saw. But one thing is for sure, I do not DoorDash at nights anymore. So, I'm still haunted by this story. I normally don't order out. I usually buy groceries for myself and then meal prep them in advance to save time and money. But I'll be honest, sometimes I just get lazy. Last winter, it was an especially cold night outside. And for context, I do live alone, and I am a 24-year-old female. Well, it was such a cold night, and I was craving my favorite local pizza place. I decided what the hell, and placed an order on DoorDash for it to be delivered. After about an hour of waiting and watching some horror movie on Netflix, I saw my phone light up with a notification from DoorDash. It said my driver was 2 minutes away. Almost as if right on cue, my doorbell rang. I excitedly opened the door to find a middle-aged man dressed in a weather-worn jacket, red beanie, and my pizza box in his hands. He handed me the pizza box and told me to enjoy my pizza as he walked away. I thanked the man, closed the door, and then went into my living room to feast. But on my way to the living room, that's when I noticed something alarming. The pizza box had the logo of a different restaurant, not from my favorite place that I had ordered from. That's when I suddenly got a text. I glanced at my screen, and my skin crawled as I read the message. "We apologize for any inconvenience. Your dasher had car troubles and is running late. Please be patient. As fear started to grip me, I instantly started to ask myself, if my dasher didn't deliver the pizza, then who did? Hesitantly, I opened the pizza box. Inside was no pizza, but a single note. It said, "Hope you're alone, sweetie." I ran over to my front living room window and looked outside. Standing a few blocks away, under one of the broken street lamps, was the stranger who delivered the pizza. He was watching my house. I quickly made sure every door and window was locked in my house, and then called the police. But when they arrived and did a sweep of the neighborhood, they didn't find anyone. I shit you not, I did not fall asleep for the next 2 weeks. I was wide awake every night, terrified that stranger was going to come back and kill me or something. Thankfully, I had my boyfriend and other family members come stay with me for a while. I don't know who the hell that man was, or how he even knew that I was ordering pizza from DoorDash. The whole situation was way too close to home, and I haven't ordered anything from DoorDash since.
When this happened, I was 23 and worked full-time at a pizza shop in my local area. I'm not sure if things were going on before this, but as far as I know, everything started and ended on this one night. Me and my best friend, Tim, worked the night shifts at this pizza place. It was a real small shop because we specialized in delivery and takeout. Both me and Tim got our jobs there while we were in college, but just never left. Being in a quiet, rural town too, the job wasn't too much work. Never had busy days really, just a steady flow of orders sometimes. On this night, there was a light storm outside, and in return, business was slow. There were a few orders here and there, but overall, we didn't have much to do. By 10 p.m., Tim suggested we started cleaning up the place, and maybe even clocking out 15 minutes early. I went with it, grabbing some rags to wipe the tables with, when the phone at the front desk rang. I picked up after a few rings.
How can we help you today? Hello?
I waited another 5 seconds before putting the phone down and shaking my head. Just some prank call, I thought. I went back to scrubbing the tables, but at the front of the store, I saw a glare coming from the window. There was a car parked a few spots back. I couldn't see too well through the window in the rain, but there was definitely a light on in the car, like a cell phone or something. The pizza shop was on an individual lot, and there were no other cars, so that was the only reason I noticed them. A moment later, the phone rang again. Tim was closer, so he picked up this time. I could hear someone's muffled voice coming from the phone, and after a short talk, Tim hung up. At the same time, the light in the car turned off, and they drove away. I told Tim what I saw and how it was a little weird, but he shrugged and said it was just some old man who was ordering a pizza for delivery. I looked back at the now empty parking lot. It wouldn't make much sense for someone to order a pizza for delivery from right outside the shop, so I figured Tim was right and it was nothing. He started making the pizza while I continued cleaning. 10 minutes later, Tim boxed it up and handed it off to me to deliver. I ran through the rain to my car, then pulled up the address on my phone. 11 minutes away. Not too bad. I pulled out and started making my way there. The roads were dead, nobody out at all. Google Maps took me down to a neighborhood full of large homes, then had me turn down a long driveway that led to a cul-de-sac, where there were 3 more driveways, each leading to a different house. I went down the one Maps told me to and pulled up next to the home. It was one of those large expensive houses, but pretty old looking and not very modern at all. I parked the car and double-checked the address with the house number, then picked up the pizza and ran up to the front door.
Hello? Pizza delivery.
I took a step back and looked at the front of the house. All of the lights were off. I dialed Tim's cell and had him call the guy who ordered. My phone buzzed a moment later, and Tim told me that his call went straight to voicemail. I shook my head in frustration and ran back through the rain to my car and got in. I tossed the pizza on the passenger seat and started backing out. This wasn't out of the ordinary, getting fake orders or dead deliveries, but it still annoyed me every time. When I got back, Tim was cleaning and said there were no more orders, so we were good to finish up and head out. I tossed the pizza in the trash and started helping him. Both of us were in the back, cleaning the ovens and wiping the prep counters, when a sudden bang came from the front of the building. We looked at each other, then ran to the front. At first, we didn't see anything, but then Tim spotted a small crack on the door. I walked over and opened it, and right outside was a heavy rock, big enough to throw and do some damage with. I looked around, seeing the parking lot was completely empty and nobody was nearby. Both of us were really confused and kind of freaked out. We talked about maybe calling the cops, but neither of us wanted to deal with that right now. To put things in perspective, it was 10 minutes before we were off, and if we called, then we'd be here for another hour at least. The crack on the door wasn't too big, not really that noticeable, so we chose to wait and just tell our manager the next day instead. We quickly finished up with the cleaning and left through the back door where our cars were parked. On the drive home, I rethought all the strange things that happened, and it made me uneasy. I pulled into my driveway and walked inside. It was late, so I knew I had to get in bed soon, but I wanted something to snack on first. I went to the kitchen to see what I had, but before I even opened the pantry, I heard a car splash through the puddles on the street outside my house. From the sound of it, I could tell it was parking. I walked over to my window and peeked outside, seeing a car parked right in front of my driveway. It only took me a second to realize it was the same car I'd seen outside the pizza shop. A cold rush went through me, and I stayed in the window to see what they were doing. The car was still on, but I couldn't see through their window. After a minute of no movement, I took out my phone and called Tim, telling him that I think one of the customers followed me home and was parked right outside my house.
Are you serious? You need to call the cops. Something's not right.
He said, urging me to hang up and call the police immediately. I don't know why I was so nervous to call the cops, but hearing Tim say it made me feel better about it. I moved away from the window and dialed 911. The lady on the line said that they would have someone on their way and that I should stay hidden and wait. I heard a car door open and close, so I quickly said okay and hung up. Looking back out the window, a man was walking up my driveway. He was wearing dark clothes, covering his whole body, and a hood covering his face. As he approached the house, I closed the curtains by the window and waited. His footsteps came to the front door, then they continued across the front of the house until they reached the outside of the window and stopped. The sudden silence made the sound of the rain increasingly louder. I felt like I was standing there quietly for minutes before I stepped forward and moved the curtain an inch to the side, just enough to peek through. The man's cold eyes stared back at me. I let go of the curtain, and the man banged on the window. I stood a few feet away, terrified to death, and just as quick as it started, it ended. There was no more banging, no footsteps, nothing. All that was left was the sound of the raindrops clicking against the window. Although I never heard the man leave, he was gone when the police showed up. No car or man in sight. I told them all that had happened from the middle of my shift to the end of the night. They looked at me like I was crazy, and part of me felt crazy too. None of it made any sense, and there didn't seem to be any motive for the man to have done what he did. Honestly, because of that, the whole night had me messed up for a while. Going through something as senseless as that was really just fucked with my head. I'm hoping that by sharing this, someone may be able to help me understand what happened, or why the man did what he did. It sounds odd, but even now, when it gets really quiet on rainy days, there's an eerie feeling that rushes through me, bringing me back to that night. My house is on the edge of a small town, having several acres of land surrounding it. It isn't extremely isolated, but the nearest house is a quarter-mile away, so it's definitely not your regular neighborhood home. I chose to live there for that reason though. Anyway, I had lived there alone for almost 6 years when this happened. It was a normal weekend, and I had no plans at all. I was spending most of my time watching TV or working outside in the garden. Sometime in the afternoon, I was walking through the house and passed by a window when I saw something odd. There was a person walking through the trees far off in the distance. It was technically my property, and I knew they could see my house from there. But what was most odd was the direction they were walking. They were walking toward the back of my house, which led to nothing but a vast woodsy area. I watched by the window as they slowly walked past my backyard and kept going until I lost sight of them in the woods. I didn't care so much that they were on the edge of my property, but it was just a weird thing to see given the location of my house. I went on with my day, looking out the window a few more times to see if he ever came back, but I never saw anything. Later in the night, I sat down to watch a movie in my living room. In the middle of the movie, I began hearing footsteps. They were soft and slow, walking through the leaves outside. I got up quietly and looked out a nearby window. I jumped back, seeing a man just a couple feet from me. After the initial shock, I poked my head up again. He looked like he didn't even notice me at all. He was still walking, slowly making his way across my yard. They looked like the same person I had seen earlier, but it was hard to say for sure. I watched them walk all the way to the other side of my property and go into the trees. It was one of the creepiest things I'd ever seen, especially since he came so close to my house this time. I stayed up a little bit later than usual to make sure he didn't come back, and I was ready to call the police if he did. By 11, I hadn't seen any signs of him at all, so I felt safe enough to get some sleep. I went upstairs and passed out. I don't know exactly what time, but I woke up in the middle of the night to that familiar sound. Footsteps right outside my house. As I got dressed and ran downstairs, the sound stopped. I looked through every window and didn't see anyone. Then I went up to the front door and looked out the peephole. That same man was standing in my driveway, looking up at my house. It was an eerie sight, like he was plotting something. I got my phone and contacted the police, but I knew it would be probably 15 to 20 minutes before they would even be here. When I looked out at the driveway again, the man was gone, and and that's when I heard the same footsteps around the side of my house. I waited quietly, hoping he'd just go away, but then there was a sharp, sudden sound from my backyard, followed by absolute silence. I was shaking, standing in the same spot, when the sound of another shot rang through the house. The silence afterward lasted for 15 minutes until the police arrived. When they did, I heard them yelling outside, telling the man to drop the gun and everything. This went on for a few minutes, but eventually the police were able to get the man to comply. There's no clear answer as to what he was doing, and after I told them about what I'd seen earlier, with him walking back and forth through the woods, it only complicated things more. As far as I know, the man was pleading it as a temporary act of insanity. Nobody knows for sure if that's true or not, but I find it hard to believe. I've been working at a warehouse for 4 years now. Compared to others, it's really small. From the outside, you probably would never even guess it was a warehouse. It's owned by a small tech company that only moves its own product, so there isn't a need for a big building. Me and my coworker, Seth, were the two main overnight workers, taking turns on the night shifts, but almost never working together. The night shift worker always had to fly solo. The main job for the overnight guy was to fill out paperwork, like inventory counts and shipment confirmations, so it wasn't really a multiple person job anyway. But one night, while I was filling out these papers in the back room, I heard a knock echo through the front of the building. When I walked to the front, there was a man standing outside the building's main entrance. He had his hands above his eyes, pressing his face against the glass door like he was trying to look inside. I walked closer to the door, and once he noticed me, he moved his face back and knocked again to get my attention.
Open the door,
he yelled, grabbing the handle and shaking the door violently. I told him he needed to leave and that the doors were not open to the public. He looked at me through the glass for a moment, then calmly walked away. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but thought it had to be some drunk guy or something. I continued with my work, but on the following night, the same thing happened. I heard the knocks, and the man was back at the entrance doors. He yelled at me again to open the door. I told him that he needed to leave, and if he ever comes back, I would call the cops right away. I think that did it, because he immediately turned around and quickly walked away from the building. The next few weeks, he never showed up. I mentioned him to some of the day workers, but they'd never seen the guy before. Then one night, I thought I heard something by the back of the building. It was a thud, I thought from the outside of the building, but I wanted to be sure. I walked to the back, but everything looked fine. Nothing had fallen over or was out of place. I walked further down to the far wall, and that's when I noticed the back door. I started wondering if that guy had come back and was at this door instead. Maybe that's what the sound was. This one wasn't glass though, and there were no windows on it, so I had no way of knowing what was on the other side. I checked to make sure it was locked, and it was, but I still had a strange feeling about it. I was tempted to open it and look around, but I knew better than to do that. I went back to work, only to hear that same sound a few minutes later. I checked again, and everything was fine inside, but the more I looked at the back door, the more of this strange feeling I got. Then I got an idea. I hurried back to the main office and decided to ease my mind by checking the security camera on the back of the building. My manager always told me that I should really never do this, but I really felt like I had to. It took me a second to find the right camera footage, but once I did, I saw that same man standing against the back door. He was leaning with his ear pressed against it, probably listening to me and hoping I'd open it. I called the cops, but it was like this guy knew somehow, because as soon as I put the phone down, he walked away. Over the next 2 days, we went through the past 2 weeks of security footage. After the 2 times I saw that guy at the front entrance and told him to leave, he continued to come to the building every single night, leaning up against the back door and listening. It was really creepy seeing this guy was at the building every night without me knowing. We had the cops stay on patrol outside the building for a few weeks after this, but the man never showed up again. I don't know what he wanted, but I still worry that he's gonna come back. This happened last month while I was still living at my previous condo. It was connected to 3 other units, and I was renting the 4th. I worked from home, and one day at noon while I was taking a break, someone rang my doorbell. I went up and answered, greeting a young lady. She was small and skinny, wearing ripped jeans and a tank top. I looked at her, waiting for her to say why she was here, but after a couple seconds, I just asked. She asked me if I was the only one living here. The way she said it was like she was confused by me being there. I said yes, and she apologized, saying she must have the wrong address. I said not to worry about it and closed the door. I went back to work after that and didn't think much else of it. A few more hours into the day, once I was done working, I went out to the supermarket and got back home around 8. When I entered my condo, I felt like something was off. I didn't know what it was, but I went ahead and put my groceries away and started cooking dinner. A few minutes in, I hear something from one of my bedrooms down the hall. All the doors in the hallway were closed, and I had no idea what the sound was, but I tried to convince myself that it was just my upstairs neighbor. I finished making my food and sat at the small dining table to eat. That's when I heard a door open. It took me a second to realize it was from my condo and not a neighbor's. I stood up and froze, hearing footsteps coming down the hallway from the bedrooms and approaching the kitchen. A second later, a man appeared from the hallway. He didn't say anything. He didn't even look at me. He just walked right past me and over to the front door, opening it and leaving. I was still standing by the table, terrified. I ran to the front door and locked it, and locked myself in a bathroom. I know the man was gone, but I was still scared that he might come back. Luckily he didn't, but police weren't able to gather any information on him. I told them everything I knew, but I only saw him for a moment and he didn't even look at me, so I never got a clear view. We asked the neighbors too, and none of them said they heard or saw anything. What's really scary is that there's no signs of a break-in, so it looks like he had to have some sort of key to get in. I also told the police about the lady that came by and how it was a weird encounter. It may have been a setup for them to scope out the place before entering. I just don't understand why this happened to me. There were a few things missing, but amounting to less than $100 total. Maybe I got home before he had the chance to grab more, but he didn't even have a backpack or anything, and the fact that they must have had a key only had me paranoid even more. I was able to move out, but it's only been a month, so I'm still shaken up. I'll probably have this to think about for the rest of my life, never knowing exactly what happened.
Last Thanksgiving, my boyfriend and I loaded our 2-month-old daughter into our car and drove from Miami to Naples to visit my family. Being new parents, we were extremely nervous about taking such a lengthy trip with the baby and packed for every possible scenario. We left shortly after 12, my boyfriend behind the wheel, and we hit the highway, which was swollen with holiday traffic. After about an hour of driving, the baby became fussy, and we pulled over at a rest stop to feed her and change her diaper. While I was changing her, my boyfriend stood outside the car stretching, and suddenly called my name. Peering outside the car, I looked across the street in the direction he was pointing. There was a clown with a purple star painted over his face, and wild, crazy, unkempt black hair, and a purple and white checkered outfit standing on the opposite side of the parking lot, just waving to people as they pulled in and out of the rest stop. I chuckled and returned to what I was doing, unbothered by the clown, figuring it was just part of some kind of promotion. As we pulled out of the station, the clown waved at us, and I gave a lazy acknowledgement back. Just before my boyfriend took his foot off the brake and eased into traffic, the clown gave me the most hungry, sinister smile I had ever seen, and shouted,
"You would look amazing draped over my lap."
Even through the closed car window, I heard him clearly, and said, "Wow, what a creep." As we drove away, I repeated what the clown had said to my boyfriend, who hadn't quite heard it, and for a few minutes he was dead set on turning around to confront him. But I told him it wasn't worth it, as we still had a long drive ahead of us. We arrived in Naples shortly after 2:30, and by then, I had already forgotten about the incident and didn't even bring it up to my parents. We had a great time at my parents' place, and ended up leaving close to 11:30 at night, much later than we had intended to. My parents tried to convince us to stay, and while we had plenty of stuff for the baby, we hadn't packed any overnight things for ourselves. So we decided just to commit to the drive. We figured that there would be a lot less traffic, and it would take a shorter amount of time to get home. My boyfriend had been driving for about 45 minutes when he asked me if I wouldn't mind taking over, as he was having a hard time keeping his eyes focused. I told him to pull over at the next rest area, and I would take the wheel. After a few minutes, we see a sign for a rest area and pull into it. It wasn't the same rest stop as before. It had no bathrooms, vending machines, or anything. It was basically just a long parking lot, with one row of parking spaces which looped back onto the road. My boyfriend pulled the car into a spot, nose first, so it was facing a long chain link fence, and beyond it, there was just trees and a swamp. I couldn't see anything specific in the glow of the headlights. He put the car in park and left the engine running, and the lights on as he climbed out of the driver's seat. The baby started to fuss as soon as the car stopped moving, and after I climbed out of the passenger seat, I opened the back door to check on her. My boyfriend climbed into the passenger seat and immediately shut his eyes. After I confirmed that the baby was fine and would probably fall back asleep when we started driving again, I shut the back door and made my way to the driver's seat. That's when I heard the sound of the chain link fence rattling and something being dragged across the metal links, steadily drawing closer. I turned in the direction of the noise, and for a split second, I only noticed the dark outline of a figure on the opposite side of the fence, until they stepped into the light of our headlights. It was the exact same clown from the other rest stop, except this time he had a large red stain splattered across his purple and white costume, and was dragging a broken beer bottle across the fence. He pressed his face directly in the fence and smiled at me. He cackled,
"Hello again,"
and started making lewd gestures with his tongue. I was at a loss for words. It was so unbelievably surreal that I could only stare at him in disbelief and horror, not knowing whether I should be truly afraid or start laughing at the absurdity of it. My boyfriend launched himself out of the passenger seat and screamed, "Get in the car!" When he opened his car door, the baby started crying out, and the sound could be heard across the silent parking lot, and the clown immediately started singing in a grotesque, uneven voice.
"Rock-a-bye baby in the treetop. When the clown comes, the cradle will rock."
My parents had given us a set of fancy glasses for our dining room table. My boyfriend launched one directly at the clown. The glass shattered against the chain link fence and sprayed tiny razor projectiles all over. The clown hissed and immediately booked it to the end of the fence. My boyfriend and I jumped into the car, slammed the doors, and locked them. I threw the car into reverse and backed out of the spot, and as we put the car in drive, we saw the clown charging towards us across the parking lot. My boyfriend yelled at me to hit him, but I swerved to avoid him and floored it out of the lot and back onto the highway. For the next several minutes, my heart was racing, convinced that at any moment a speeding car would come up behind us and try to run us off the road, but fortunately that never happened. We were so shaken and traumatized that all we could do for the rest of the way home was ask each other over and over again, what the heck just happened? We could only speculate what the guy was doing out there at 12 a.m., dressed like a clown in the middle of the Everglades on Thanksgiving night. We considered that he was just trying to mess with people. But you would need some serious balls to pull that kind of stunt out there in the Everglades. The people that live around there don't put up with that kind of nonsense. And what was he even doing there? Just hiding behind the dark fence for a completely random car to show up so he could traumatize them? I don't know if the stain on his suit was actually blood, but he made us feel threatened enough that we felt justified throwing something at him. And seeing as how his response was to charge us, I suspect that his intentions were hostile. The fact that we had seen him earlier that day made the situation even worse, because it felt like he was stalking us. My boyfriend had a license to carry a gun, so all I can say is, it's a good thing that he wasn't packing that particular night. This Thanksgiving, we plan to stay home. I know when most people think of a female clown, they immediately think of the charismatic and very sexy Batman villain Harley Quinn, but I promise they're not all like that. Back in 2012, I was walking home one night at around 9. I live in Gilbert, Arizona, and was walking by a large wide open park with a couple of soccer fields and basketball courts when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. The overhead lights were still on and illuminating the fields, and I noticed someone sitting cross-legged out on the grass. I pulled out my earbuds and stepped off the sidewalk to get a closer look. At first, I thought maybe it was someone who had hurt themselves, but as I took a few steps closer, I noticed that it was a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, leaning forward over something. It was hard to tell her exact age because her face was covered in white makeup, and a red heart and a black spade painted on her cheeks. Her top lip was painted black, and her bottom lip dark red. She was wearing a gray hoodie with the hood up, but had 2 holes cut on either side to accommodate her blonde pigtails. I stopped in my tracks and glanced around, convinced that this was a YouTube prank or something. But we were in the middle of a wide open area, and aside from the occasional car passing by, we seemed completely alone. The clown lady was wearing bright red sneakers, torn jeans, and some kind of clawed glove on her right hand like Freddy Krueger. I was only a dozen feet or so away, close enough to say something, but I decided to back away slowly and not engage in whatever she was doing. As I took a step back, she called out to me without looking up.
Where are you going? Come here!
"Nah, I'm good," I replied, and continued to walk away. For the first time she looked up, and smiled way too big, showcasing far more teeth and gums than was necessary. She raised the clawed hand, and I noticed that at the ends of each fingertip was a sharp point, like a thumbtack.
You sure? More for me then.
That's when she pulled out a large kitchen knife, the size of an ear of corn, and started cutting into the thing on the ground. I glanced back down and noticed the thing that she was leaning over appeared to be a dead bird of some kind, and she was using her clawed hand to pull the feathers off. She stabbed at the bird with the blade, and then pulled out a flask out of her pocket and threw back a swig. I nearly fell backwards into the road as I maneuvered myself off the grass and onto the sidewalk. I didn't want to turn my back on her the whole time, convinced that it was a prank, and I should start looking around in every direction for someone with a camera or a phone. But there was no one else even remotely close by, and no place they could be hiding either. I quickly turned around and power walked down the sidewalk towards my apartment complex. As I reached the intersection, I was forced to wait for the traffic light to change, so I could cross safely. My earbuds were back in, but I honestly wasn't listening to the music. I was so confused and unnerved by what I had just seen. I glanced over my shoulder and saw to my horror that the lady clown was walking up the sidewalk towards me, appearing to be looking directly at me. I wrenched out my earbuds again, glanced both ways, up and down the street, and even though the light was still green and the cars had the right-of-way, I sprinted across. When I reached the other side, I turned and saw that she was still approaching the intersection. She waved at me with her clawed hand, and a few feathers fluttered to the ground. She called out to me.
Don't get killed tonight.
At least I'm pretty sure that's what she said. There were sounds of traffic muffling her voice. I literally ran home, entered my gated apartment complex, and went the long way around the building just to make sure I wasn't being followed. I then climbed up the stairs, locked both of my locks, and stared out my peephole in a panic. For about 5 minutes before I finally calmed down, I didn't turn on any lights in the apartment, and instead used my phone to navigate to my bedroom, and then used a light from my laptop screen to change and go to bed. The following day, when the sun was high in the sky, I double-checked the spot where the clown lady had been, and the mutilated remains of a bird were lying on the grass. A few weeks later, I saw her again in broad daylight. I was driving my friend's car and noticed her walking down the sidewalk in full makeup in the exact same hoodie, dragging a garbage bag behind her. I turned the car around out of morbid curiosity and followed her for about a half mile, pulling over on the side of the road to let her walk ahead for a while and slowly continuing on. When she reached a wide open plot of dirt, I saw her pull out what looked like to be a dead rat from the garbage bag. She cut it open with a switchblade and wrung it out like a sponge, blood spilling onto the ground, and probably all over her clothes as well. That's when she turned towards me, and with blood running down her fingers, raised her right hand and put her thumb between her index finger and middle finger. This is known as giving someone the fig, and if anything, it's even more obscene than raising your middle finger. I immediately backed the car up and got the hell out of there. It's not that when she turned towards me that bothered me. She easily could have realized that she was being followed. It was the gesture she gave me. It's one I commonly use at people in traffic, and I always get a kick out of it because hardly anyone knows what that means. But I've never seen anyone else use it in my life, and the fact that she did really shook me. I mean, what are the chances she knew that I would understand it? I've since moved, but my buddy still lives out there, and occasionally tells me he spots her wandering the side of the road. So next time you're in Gilbert, keep an eye out.
My name is Daniel Roberts. I'm a 20-year-old man, and I live in a small town in Arizona with my single mother. This story happened a year ago. I worked at a post office, and it was lousy pay. But it was the only job I was able to get at the time. So one night, I was on my way home from work when I realized my gas was running low. So I drove to the nearest gas station and parked my car at the pump. And as soon as I went inside the store to pay for my gas, this woman walked up to me. She looked very young, about 18 years old. By the way she dressed, I could tell she was a goth. Her face is covered in black makeup and had long curly hair. She had on a long gothic coat, skinny jeans, and long black boots. Anyway, she was very nice at first by asking me about myself, like, what's your name? Where are you from? Where do you work at? You know, normal questions. After I answered all her questions, I said, it was very nice to meet you. You have a good night. And I thought that was it, so I paid for my gas and walked outside towards my car. Then the woman began following me to my car, and I turned around and said, do you need anything? And she said no, and came to tell me that I had a nice car. And I said thanks. I tried to be calm, even though at this point, I am freaked out. She walked back inside the store, so I finished pumping my gas into my car and got inside. I was about to drive off, but then I felt a little hungry, and decided to grab a snack. Since I thought I was going to be quick, I left my car running with the doors unlocked. I walked inside the store, and while I was looking for a snack, I noticed the woman walked out of the store, and she was walking towards my car. And as soon as she saw me walk outside with her, she ran to my car and got into the front passenger seat of my car and locked the doors. I yelled at her to get the hell out of my car, but she didn't say anything and gave me an evil smile that creeped me out. Then she scooted over to the driver's seat and drove off. I immediately called 911 to report to them that my car was stolen. I told the police that my car has a GPS tracker and I can track down my car. So the police took me to where my car GPS was. We found my car. It was abandoned on the side of the road. It was vandalized and had writings on the seats saying, "I will see you again, and I will kill you." Still to this day, they never found her, and I will always be traumatized for the rest of my life.
This disturbing story happened during the year of 2019. However, if you would like to animate it, you shall. It took place in the time of quarantine, when almost everything was shut down. I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio, but moved to Virginia because the countryside is more peaceful and doesn't have as many thugs. I worked as a night auditor in a hotel. I won't say the name due to safety reasons. My shifts were usually from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. One night after my shift, I went outside while it was still slightly dark when a tall, stocky man started walking towards me, cradling something in a blanket. I'd been trying to avoid as much human interaction as possible on account of the pandemic, and I am a single mother to 4 very young boys, my youngest being only 6 months old. I was already having a suspension of the man anyway, because who would randomly be standing outside of a hotel with a baby at 6 o'clock in the morning? I tried to hurry to my car before he could get to me, but he said, "Excuse me, ma'am, I need to go to your house to change my baby's diaper. He hasn't been changed since yesterday." Call me mean if you want to, but there was no way I was going to take him to my house. I had sympathy for the baby, but I had my own children's safety to worry about. I said, "Sir, I will unlock the hotel's public bathroom so you can use the diaper changing station in there." "No," he yelled. I then started sprinting to my car. Of course, he chased me. I locked the doors as soon as I got in, but when I started driving, the man jumped out in front of me. He moved once he realized that either he was going to get out of my way or get run over. The next night when I clocked in, I noticed a letter in my cubbyhole that read, "You little bitch, you're lucky that we were outside a building full of people. Just remember that next time, your luck might not be as fortunate." Under my desk was a fake baby doll, wrapped in some color blanket that the man was cradling the night before. The realization showered me in fear. I showed my boss and told him that I didn't want to work a night job anymore, thinking that the man might be stalking me during the nights. A few days later, I found out how wrong I was. I was at home enjoying a peaceful day with my children when I got a creepy letter with no return address that read, "You think you got away? I followed you home from work. I know where you live. I know what you drive. I see you outside as you watch over your little blood bags while they're playing in the yard every evening. I know their names. I know what they look like. I know everywhere they go. Remember, I'm always watching." I kept receiving those sickening, disturbing letters for a long time. The police said that the man left no fingerprints on the letters, so there was nothing much they could do. I didn't let my children go outside much anymore. One morning, it was past midnight when I heard knocking on the door. I looked out the peephole to see the same man from the night at the hotel. I remained silent, thinking maybe he will think I'm not home until he said, I've been here a lot longer than you think. I know you're right there, and all 4 of your blood bags are in there somewhere. Just wait until I get in there and put my hands on them." I ran upstairs, gathered my children, and locked them in a room with me. I called the police, and that's when I heard glass shattering from downstairs. The man was in the house now. He searched downstairs for what seemed like 20 minutes, then came upstairs, kicking every door and shouting. The shouting grew louder. He was right outside the room we were in. The commotion startled my 6-month-old, so he started whining and moaning. I brought him to my chest, trying to calm him. He was starting to quiet down until the man threw a heavy object at the door and shouted louder. My baby then threw his head back and let out a long and loud cry. The man started kicking the door until I finally heard the police sirens pulling in my driveway. The kicking stopped, and I heard footsteps running down the stairway. The police caught him as soon as he tried to call out the back window. They told me that he had been wanted for assault, harassment, and child abduction. That happened 2 years ago, and my oldest son, who is now 8 years old, has not been the same since. He acts scared to go outside. My other 3 sons are now 6, 4, and 2. However, they do not understand the situation like my oldest does, and I dread having to tell them, due to the trauma that it could bring them.
I love to drive, like hours-long drives to nowhere with no destination in mind. Just me, my music, and the road ahead of me. Living in Nebraska, I'd often take back roads or lonely highways cutting through the countryside to small towns and eventually cities, and I'd usually take these drives at night since they were less traffic to worry about. I've done it since I've had my license 4 or 5 years ago, and I've never once had any sort of issue, nor have I ever run into any trouble. That was until a few nights ago. For reference, I'm a relatively small 22-year-old female, and as I stated before, I often take these drives completely and utterly alone. They're a good way to clear my head when I'm stressed, upset, or overwhelmed, or for me to get a plan together to sort personal issues out. I've also done these long and lonely drives to get away from the toxicity of my household when I used to live with my parents as a means of coping with their alcoholism. Though now that I moved out and am in a much better place mentally, I don't really have the urge to get in my car and just drive anymore. However, on the night that this event took place, I was feeling pretty overwhelmed, stressed, and anxious with a ton of personal issues I'd rather not get into. I felt restless and irritable around my boyfriend, couldn't focus on anything else, and decided I could take a drive to clear my head. My boyfriend was understanding and told me to be careful and to not be gone for too terribly long since it was getting pretty late. I agreed, gave him a kiss goodbye, and left. I drove around our city for about 30 minutes, but I was still feeling on edge about everything transpiring in my personal life, so I decided to drive further north down those familiar, dark, winding one-lane highways. I kept the car at a steady 65 miles per hour, taking the turns at a slower pace in case a deer jumped out around the bend, and was just admiring the vast empty darkness of the snow-capped fields and barren trees. It was honestly a bit creepy being all alone with no cars in sight, in seemingly the middle of nowhere. The few houses miles back from the road, lightless, and the dead cornfields withered away and covered in snow. It was like something out of a horror movie, and I half expected to see a ghost pop up in my rearview mirror or see someone clamber out from the patches of trees dotting the horizon. The only light came from the headlights, and even then I still strained to see through the inky darkness of the night. By now it was just after 11, and I told myself that once I made the familiar roundabout that would either take you to a small town or back up towards the city, I would head back to the city and home. That roundabout was still maybe 15 to 25 minutes away, but other than my imagination picturing the worst, I wasn't really all that concerned. I mean, I was by myself. I didn't have any other motorist to worry about, right? As I'm rounding around another bend, I notice a vehicle with its hazard lights maybe a quarter of a mile or something away from me. It was some sort of sedan, dark colored, and was angled to where only part of it was on the shoulder while the rest was jutted out into the road. Like they had pulled over in a hurry but didn't quite manage to do that. The driver's side door was flung wide open, and as I slowed my vehicle down and angled it towards the opposite side of the road to pass, I could make out what looked like maybe blood on the open door. I didn't see anyone on the road or in the car, and I was the only motorist in sight. Cell phone reception is spotty at best in this part of the country, but more often than not, you couldn't get reception no matter how hard you prayed, which was definitely the case when I took a glance at my phone to see I hadn't had any service. So, a lone female on the road at night, pulling up near a vacant vehicle that looks like someone had been attacked on the inside, with no cell service. No, I'm no dummy. I've watched countless episodes of Investigation Discovery and Criminal Minds, and read far too many true crime books to know that this had bad and danger written all over it. But there was still a small part of me that worried something terrible had happened to whoever was in that vehicle, and I thought I needed help. These roads don't get a lot of traffic late at night, and temperatures were well below freezing. If someone were hurt or in trouble, there was no one and nothing else to help them but me. Still, I erred on the side of caution. I was still driving my car, though a bit more slowly, and as I approached the vehicle, I rolled down my window a bit, shut off the music, and called out, "Hey, anyone there? Are you okay?" I didn't hear a response. I worried they were passed out somewhere, but I wasn't about to get out and look for them. I told myself I'd call out one last time, and if I didn't hear anything, I would leave, and the moment there was reception, I'd call it in. And if I did hear someone, well, I had figured out my next course of action then. So again, I shut out, "Hey, what happened? Are you okay?" There was silence for a beat, and then I heard rustling in the shadows of the trees, followed by a gruff voice saying, "Yeah." I was relieved at first, and was about to say something in response, or possibly even stop my car and get out, when I noticed three things nearly simultaneously. As I inched my way past the front of the sedan, I noticed that there was no damage to the hood anywhere else in the vehicle, which I found to be strange considering the blood on the inside of the door. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glance of someone coming out from behind the sedan, and they were making their way towards my car, fast. The person did not have any blood on them, or appeared injured in any way, wearing a mask. Not like a face mask from the pandemic or a ski mask or anything normal, but one of those masks you could see in the Purge movies, and they were holding something in their hand. I don't know what it was. I couldn't get a look, but from its length and shape, my guess was maybe a tire iron or a crowbar or something. I don't need to tell you that I slammed on the gas the moment I noticed those things and drove like a maniac out of there. My heart thundering in my chest and my entire body shaking. My window was still rolled down in my haste and the music was still shut off, so I could very clearly hear someone, definitely a man, shouting at me, though I had no clue what they were saying. I just knew I had to get out of there immediately. I stole one last look in my rearview mirror as I drove away, mostly to see if they were getting in their sedan to follow chase or if they had stopped. The man with the weapon was still standing in the middle of the road watching me, and right before I looked away from the mirror, I saw a second man also wearing one of those creepy masks and no trace of blood on him. I probably broke every law for speeding that night, but I wanted to get as far away from those men as possible. As soon as I made it to the roundabout, I turned towards town, parked in the Walmart parking lot that thankfully still had cars from who I assumed were workers closing up shop, and proceeded to have a full-on meltdown. When I could pull myself together, I called one of my friends, T, who was a police officer, to tell him what happened and what I should do. He was concerned for me, and after asking if I was okay, where I was, did they follow me, etc., he told me since it was out of city limits, he couldn't do much on his end, but he could get in contact with the local police sheriff in that jurisdiction to take my statement and check it out. I agreed, thanked him, and while I waited for police to show up, I called my boyfriend. Through my hysterical sobs and panic, I managed to tell him what happened not even 10 or so minutes ago. He was, as you can imagine, super freaked out for my safety and wanted me to either come home immediately or drive down himself to take me home. I told him the police were on their way to take my statement, so I couldn't leave and that I was okay, but I stayed on the phone with him until I saw the familiar police cruisers pulling into the lot. I gave the police my statement and they assured me that they would go back to the spot. I told them that the sedan had been to take a look and they would try to catch the guys who did it, though with no cameras and no description of the men, I wasn't sure what they'd be able to do. I didn't even get the license plate number, though at the time of my panic, the thought never came to mind until the police were asking if I got it. All they had to go off of was a dark-colored sedan and 2 guys with masks. After I gave my statement, I went home and stayed curled up close to my boyfriend the whole night, listening to every sound the house made in fear that it would be those guys arriving any minute to finish whatever it was they started. Since the incident, I haven't heard back from the police about whether or not they had any leads, and I'm not sure if they ever will. I'm just thankful I'm still here and that I didn't stop my car or get out. I'm not sure what would have become of me if I had. I still had so many questions that have no answers. What were they doing? Why? Was that blood on the inside of the car, or just a ruse to get more attention? If it was really blood, did they hurt someone else? What would have happened to me if I had stopped my car? Needless to say, I won't be going on any more late-night drives to anywhere, and I hope I never cross paths with those freaks again. This is Blanche Monnier. Born on the 1st of March 1849 into a wealthy French merchant family from the city of Poitiers, Blanche was famed for her striking beauty and delicate manner. Naturally, this attracted a great number of potential suitors, some from prominent positions in high society. But Blanche didn't want to marry for money or prestige, and she especially didn't want to spend the rest of her natural life with some beastly brute she barely knew. No, Blanche was in love. Around the age of 25, she had met a lawyer almost 10 years her senior. Despite his practice being a small and modest affair, Blanche was smitten with him. She didn't care if he didn't have the treasury or titles of some of her other potential husbands. She loved him for the nurturing, caring person he was. Yet in 1874, upon finally expressing her desire to marry the man, Blanche discovered her mother's reaction not to be one of joy, but one of disdain and disgust. "No daughter of mine is going to marry some penniless lawyer," Louise Monnier is thought to have said. "You'll wed whomsoever your father and I choose." But Blanche was defiant. She told her mother that she was free to marry whoever she pleased. She wasn't an object to be traded to boost the Monniers' esteem, and if her mother insisted on behaving in such a ghastly manner, she'd have no choice but to elope with her law-practicing lover. That night, once all were asleep, Blanche packed a small traveling case with only a handful of her most precious possessions and attempted her escape. Yet when she reached the bottom of the staircase, she heard a shrill voice pierce the darkness behind her. Going somewhere? It was her mother. Louise had been watching and waiting to apprehend her daughter's attempt to fly the nest, and it turned out she had a rather draconian punishment in mind. What happened remained a closely guarded family secret for the next 27 years, and when the public came to learn of Blanche Monnier's fate, they were horrified by what they heard. To most who know her, Blanche was there one day and gone the next. The sprightly young woman seemed to have just dropped off the face of the earth. Blanche's uncle Marcel, when questioned as to what happened to Blanche, would give the same story as her mother. She ran away, said she was going to live with that lawyer of hers. "We miss her terribly, and we wish she'd come home." But this lawyer insisted he had not seen his beloved Blanche since the day she'd requested to marry him. and placed the blame for her disappearance squarely at the feet of the Meunier family. Her disappearance caused such a concern that a representative of the Poitiers magistrate visited the home to verify Louise Meunier's story. There, they were shown how her armoire had been emptied of clothing, along with a note purported to be written by Blanche herself that referred to eloping with my beloved. This seemed to have satisfied the authorities, and the blame once again shifted to Blanche's paramour. And although he was never formally charged in connection with her disappearance, he insisted on his innocence until his sudden death in 1885. In the years that followed, Blanche was slowly forgotten about as the world moved on without her. Just another victim of class and circumstance in a culture that sees its daughters as little more than property. Then, on May 23rd of 1901, a high-ranking government official in Paris received a frighteningly intriguing letter from an anonymous author. The envelope that was simply marked with the French words, "For Mr. Attorney General," the letter reads as follows: "Dear Sir, it is with the great sorrow that I must inform you of an exceptionally serious occurrence. I speak of a spinster who is locked up in Madame Meunier's house in Poitiers, half-starved and living in a putrid litter for the past 25 years, in a word, in her own filth. She is in dire need of assistance, as I fear her health to be in a grave condition. Please help her. Yours." It reads as if whoever had written the letter was just about to sign their name, then decided against it at the last moment. And maybe this is a sign that Madame Meunier's power and influence reach far beyond the regional government of Poitiers. Regardless of her high status, Madame Louise Meunier soon had her lavish home swarmed by French gendarmerie policemen. She demanded to know why they were there, yet the commanding officer simply ignored her, instructing his men to thoroughly search the cellars and attic spaces of the large house. It was then that Madame Meunier realized why they were there, but there was no mad dash to escape, no attempt to hide her crimes. By then, the damage had been done. While searching the attic of the house, police found a small, locked door that they were unable to gain entry to. They demanded that Madame Meunier produce the key, but she told them that she'd misplaced it sometime prior to their unexpected visit. This was of no import to the gendarmerie, who promptly smashed the door off its hinges before squeezing their way into the tiny room of the other side. The sight that greeted them elicited terrified gasps and exclamations from the policemen. They were gendarmerie, military policemen, trained to combat hordes of rioters on the streets of France. They were hard men, ready for anything, but nothing could have prepared them for what waited for them on the other side of that attic door. And this is what they saw. The woman they found had evidently been imprisoned in what can only be described as harrowing conditions. She was weak, on the verge of death, weighing little more than 55 pounds by the time she was rescued. Confined to a small, filthy mattress, the woman was surrounded by pieces of rotten food, pails of urine and stale water, and piles of her own excrement. The carpet and sheets were positively alive with a nightmarish array of parasitic insects, fat from feeding off of the fragile form of the imprisoned woman. One officer described the stench inside the room as unbreathable, and the officers were forced to return with masks in order to continue their grim work. Yet the most shocking discovery of all came when the emaciated woman was asked her name. Officers were so shocked that they asked her to repeat it. "My name," she said, struggling for breath, "is Blanche Meunier." Blanche wasn't dead. Her mother hadn't had her killed as punishment for her escape attempt. Instead, she had been kept prisoner in a small windowless room for almost 30 years. Blanche was rushed to the hospital following her discovery, and while it's certain that doctors managed to save her life, she was never quite the same. She continued to suffer from a number of mental health problems and struggled to adjust to her newfound freedom. Doctors diagnosed her with a variety of debilitating physical conditions, but it has to be mental scarring which Blanche suffered that proves to be the most debilitating. Psychiatrists declared that Blanche showed signs of anorexia nervosa, schizophrenia, exhibitionism, and coprophilia. Her anorexia is somewhat easily explained by the severe food restrictions placed on her, while the devastating isolation she suffered can explain the schizophrenia. But somehow the exhibitionism hits harder than the former pair, because it shows Blanche was so desocialized and damaged by her isolation that she'd forgotten why she had to wear clothes. Nudity wasn't taboo for her anymore, as if she'd somehow become feral as a result of her suffering. The exhibition of coprophilic symptoms are also enough to make even the toughest of us shudder, as the idea of a person driven so mad by hunger that they'd eat their own excrement is perhaps one of the most horrifying concepts imaginable. These severe mental health conditions led to Blanche being admitted to a psychiatric hospital in the central French city of Blois, where she'd eventually died alone and in obscurity in 1913 at the age of 64. Blanche's mother, on the other hand, managed to escape the swift and unforgiving justice she so richly deserved. Shortly after her arrest, she became terribly ill, and a French judge was forced to allow her to remain on house arrest instead of being interred at the city jail. Just 15 days later, after the news of her crimes had circulated among the Pontier peasantry, an angry mob began to gather outside of the Monnier home. It's then that Madame Monnier, upon learning of the vengeful mob, died suddenly as a result of some previously unknown illness. But between you and me, I think it's all too much of a coincidence that Madame Monnier just so happened to pass away in the face of imminent danger, and it's more likely that she took the coward's way out. It was more bad news in the case of her uncle, Marcel Monnier, who, despite being initially convicted of kidnapping and false imprisonment, was later acquitted on appeal. Bizarrely, a judge suddenly found Marcel to be mentally incapacitated, and that a duty to rescue was not a statute in the French Penal Code. Therefore, Marcel lacked sufficient grounds to be convicted and was set free. As horrifying though Blanche's story was, it was almost lost to history for a time before 1930, when French author André Gide published a novel based on the incident. Interest in the case was reignited, and the French people were once again horrified by the story of a mother who was soulless enough to inflict unimaginable cruelty upon her own flesh and blood. Louise Monnier had intended to lock her daughter away from the world until people forgot she even existed. But history has a way of bringing to light what is done in the dark. So now all should know of Blanche Monnier, or as she is known by the French in the early 20th century, La Séquestrée des Pontiers, the confined woman of Pontier. Take a look at this picture. What is it you see? Is it a doodle? Something someone scribbled absent-mindedly one day whilst talking on the phone? To the untrained eye, what's scribbled on this piece of paper might well appear to be gibberish, but to the improbable few of us that recognized old German cursive handwriting, they might well be able to make out the two words that constitute the entirety of that wall of text: Herzenschatzi and Komm. As it turns out, what you're looking at was intended to be a letter written by a woman named Emma Hoch and addressed to her absent husband. Born in Ellwangen in Germany in August of 1878, Emma was admitted to the psychiatric hospital at the University of Heidelberg after being diagnosed with dementia praecox at the age of just 30 years old. While a patient at the secure facility, Emma wrote a series of highly disturbing and upsetting letters to her husband, often consisting of just a few words repeated over and over again. In the letter you're looking at, she has written the words Herzenschatzi komm, meaning, darling, please come, and then komm, 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 repeated over and over. It's thought that these phrases have been repeated almost 1,000 times on the small piece of paper, and that Emma's husband was extremely upset upon reading the letter, as it was clear that her condition hadn't improved in the least bit since her admission. Emma died on April 1st of 1920, and the hospital staff decided to store her many letters in a rather special place indeed. You see, the University of Heidelberg, where Emma received her treatment, has an entire department dedicated to the artwork produced by its psychiatric patients, known as the Prinzhorn Collection. It's here that Emma's letters were filed away and forgotten about for 80 years, when the Prinzhorn Collection put on an outsider art exhibit in Manhattan, New York City. Once a source of horror and heartbreak for those that knew her, this new generation of artists were fascinated by such candid representations of mental illness. They became the subject of a number of documentary films and were even adapted into a theater play around 2019. Such creative types have managed to put all kinds of spin and interpretation onto Emma's letters, claiming the pieces say more about the person viewing them than they do about Emma herself. But anyone who knows the backstory of such a picture knows that all it speaks is the immense loneliness and suffering of a person who didn't understand what was wrong with her. A person whose sole wish was to be reunited with the man she loved, a man who barely even recognized her anymore, neither physically nor mentally. May she rest in peace. I was almost 30 and female, and I have been told I look 16 to 18 depending on the outfit. I have an anxiety disorder, and additionally, I have issues picking up social cues, so sometimes I misunderstand things, or get paranoid about things that are really innocent, so I've learned to question my thoughts. I've been working in the food service industry for a few years, and in particular about 2 years at the Burger King this happened in. This incident happened about 4 years ago now. I had just started working some late-night shifts, and we hired a new manager, Paul. He was a foot or so taller than me, skinny, with dark eyes, and usually wore large glasses. He wasn't physically imposing, but still made me nervous because he was new and male, There are reasons new males put me on edge, but that's for another day. After a few days, I noticed some strange things. Whenever I worked the counter, he would stand so close behind me that I could feel the cloth of his shirt brush my neck because he was looking over my shoulder. Again, I worked here before he did and had for a year, so it bugged me. If I was stuck in the drive-thru area instead, he would stand in such a way that I was blocked in and couldn't get past him, and every time I bent over, if I looked up, I could tell that he was staring right at me. At first I figured I was just imagining it, that he wasn't purposely blocking me in. I had to be just paranoid again, I assumed. After a few more weeks of working there, he started buying pizza for the crew, or drinks, etc. for a nearby business, and he always was the one to go pick it up and bring it in. I wouldn't eat anything unless the rest of the crew did, and I never drank anything I didn't get for myself, nor did I leave anything in the back office just in case, because I just felt something was wrong. I kept telling myself it's overreacting, you're fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling. One night I was told I had to do a late night shift. Just me, Paul, and Jack, someone that has worked there for a long time, and I trust him implicitly. Before the others left, I asked Jack to please keep an eye on Paul because he scared me. That night Paul asked me to clean the bathrooms, and I had no choice but to agree. To illustrate the layout to the bathrooms of the building, in order to get to the bathrooms from the main office, you go by the kitchen, around the corner, through a door, into an entryway. From there you open the men's room door, and from there is a back wall stall with a door. That's the stall I was in. So I'm there in the main men's stall, and Jack is in the kitchen as far as I know, with Paul in the office. As my back is turned, I hear the propped open men's room door shut. I turn around, and blocking my exit to the men's stall is Paul. Immediately I panic because that means that's 3 closed doors between me and Jack. Paul holds up a pair of drive-thru headgear and makes a comment like, "So I found these new ones in the office. Want to use them? I probably shouldn't give them to you, but I like you, so I figured why not?" I decline, and honestly I was shaking out of my shoes. Innocent as the dialogue was, he was looking me up and down the whole time, and it just felt creepy. He stood there about a foot away and just stared at me, not saying anything. And after a minute or so, Jack came in and said that there was a phone call and Paul had to come get it. Naturally, I booked it out of the bathroom and stuck myself to Jack, explaining that I was really scared and felt uncomfortable with the way Paul looked at me and the odd way he was behaving. Well, to me it was odd anyway, but again I felt like I was probably being paranoid. He told me he wouldn't let me out of his sight the rest of the night and that he was sorry that he had been distracted. He didn't like Paul either, and he kept good on his word. A few hours later, Paul says he's grabbing pizza and some soda from the place I mentioned earlier. When he came back, he called me to the back office and offered me a glass of soda, pre-poured. I said no thanks, I'm fine. Thinking to myself to the time that I'm being overly stupidly paranoid, but then again, why did he always bring soda? We had over 100 kinds on the premises. He asked me another 2 to 3 times if I was sure, and I again declined, Jack right beside me. Then Paul asked me if I had a boyfriend. I did, but I lied and said fiancé because I figured it maybe dissuaded any potential flirting. He says, "Fiancé? Aren't you a little young for that?" I don't know why, but I told him my age. He just kind of sat there and looked me up and down really slow. "Oh, I thought you were 16 or 17. From there, he left me pretty much alone. Believe it or not, 3 days later he was arrested because the place he worked for before, he had inappropriately touched an underage female coworker, threatened them, and told them he was a cop and so on and would arrest them if they told. Eventually he was transferred from there to where I work, and we were never told anything till his arrest. He comes by twice since then, even though he's not allowed on the property because we have minors on site. I'm still freaked out, especially because the last time he came around, he came through the drive-thru where I was standing. So to Paul, I hope I never see you again, and you get exactly what you deserve. For a little backstory, the legal drinking age in my country is 18, so if you want alcohol and didn't have a fake ID or a parent to get it for you, then you had to wait outside of the off license, which is like a liquor store for the Americans, until someone came by who agreed to go in and purchase the alcohol for you. So we waited around, found someone who was willing to go in and buy our alcohol for us, and got him to purchase a few bottles of vodka for me and a few friends, two of which I was with. Now, as it was around 6 p.m., we decided it was too much of a risk to decant our vodka into a less suspicious-looking bottle in the middle of the street, as it was very busy, so we did what we would usually do in this situation and found a nearby food place to quickly run in and use the bathroom to decant our alcohol so we could be on our merry way. This time we chose to do this in a nearby McDonald's. We'd done it in before, so we knew it was a safe bet. So we go into the McDonald's and head straight for the bathroom, as we'd done a million times before. As we get into the bathroom, me and my other two friends, we'll call them Harriet and Kara, all occupy one cubicle to get the job done and get out and back to our drinking ASAP. And as I previously mentioned, we'd done this lots of times before and usually opted to come into this McDonald's as it was usually busy, which meant no one paid attention to three teenagers running straight to the toilet without purchasing anything. So anyway, we're all in there doing our thing when I could suddenly hear a lot of shifting and moving above us. I figured it was possibly the air conditioning and opted not to tell my friends as I thought it would freak them out. We get the job done, and as we're about to leave the cubicle, we hear a giggle and a, "Where are you girls off to?" I looked up and see the forehead and eyes of a male who looked to be about 30, just staring out from underneath the tile in the ceiling that he'd slightly lifted. We're all in shock, just staring at this guy who proceeded to giggle down at us and ask our names, where we were going to, and if he could come. We're all in shock because, let's be honest, who really expects there to be some random guy in the ceiling of a McDonald's? Being a teenager who thought I was untouchable, I proceeded to tell the guy that he was a perv and to F right off. The guy seemed to enjoy this and giggled a little more, still shifting around in the ceiling, never taking his eyes off of us. Now, I should probably mention that along with pouring our drinks into other bottles, we pre-rolled a few joints, so we were scared to alert anyone at this point, as we were young and terrified of our parents finding out. The guy, still staring at us, proceeds to ask questions like, "What age are you guys? Where do you live? Can I have some of your drink and smoke of your weed?" Still all the while twitching and fidgeting overhead. He then started to lift the tile, and as we're all stuck in a cubicle with this guy above us, we knew the only way for him to get down was to come down directly on top of us. So we got out of there at that point pretty quickly. We went outside and discussed what we were going to do, and I decided to go back in and alert someone, as it's a very busy McDonald's, and I knew that there would be women and children in and out of the toilet until closing time. I didn't want to risk that creep staying up there just to spy on them, especially since I knew he was there and had witnessed his behavior firsthand. So I go in, tell a member of staff that I'd been in the toilet for a long while talking on a phone call. Terrible lie, but my 15 to 16-year-old brain was too scared to tell the truth in case they alerted the police. And that's when the guy had appeared, and to my shock, they were completely unsurprised. They were just angry more than anything. I've seen a few male members of staff enter the toilet, and I figured they could handle it from there, so I went on my way. We still went into that McDonald's, but never had any encounters with that bathroom fairy, or not even sure if the guy got caught, as we didn't hear anything about it afterwards. So a few days after my 19th birthday, a few of my buddies and I are rolling around town in one of our cars, passing bottles and generally getting up to no good. We find a spot to park up, have a few smokes and blast some music, hanging out and just messing around until long after the sunset. Eventually, once we get hungry enough, we decided to drive over to Burger King to get a bite to eat. Now, I'm pretty lit by that point, and I've been lying if I said I wasn't generally being a complete jerk here, but here goes. So the Burger King drive-thru is closed for some reason, so we park the car up, get out, and head into the restaurant. And at the head of this huge line was this giant ham beast who was in the middle of waving her arm flab around, making some animated complaint about her order. My drunk buddies and I proceeded to watch this ham beast making an absolute idiot out of herself for like 10 minutes straight, holding up the entire line until eventually she steps to the side to wait for her corrected order or whatever. Either way, the line starts to move again. Everyone is super livid at this hog lady for holding up the line, and I could tell the workers behind the counter were less than pleased with her too. So by the time I get to the front to give my order, I'm feeling all cocky and righteous, and for some reason I had it in my head that if I made the workers laugh by roasting the hog lady, I'd get like a free meal out of it or something. So I say something to the effect of, "May I apologize on behalf of humanity for the irate snuffling of my heavy friend here." No one laughs. They all just look pretty shocked, looking back and forth between the ham beast and myself, waiting for the aftermath. She turns red in the face and I expect her to explode on me. I'm ready for the black eye or whatever. It was worth it just to hear my buddies cracking up behind me. But she didn't flip her lid. She didn't say a word. She just sort of stood there, steaming mad until the guy behind the counter appeared with her amended food order. Then she just sits down and starts eating her food. We get our food and sit down on the opposite side of the restaurant, and all the while my buddies are like, "Come on, man, you burned her, jeez, dude." But I'm looking over at her, because the ham beast is on her phone, just talking all quiet, but every so often she shoots us a little bit of a look with this big smug grin on her fat face. I don't know what I was expecting to happen, but why I thought I'd get away with it, I have no idea. Because the moment we walked out of that restaurant, we just hear from behind us, "There he is. That one, right there." I look around, and she's pointing at me, the same smug grin on her face. Then when I turn back, there's a gun in my face. I honestly can't remember what the dude was screaming at me, only that he was, but I know it was her husband. It's weird the little details you notice when something like that happens to you. I distinctly remember seeing the dude's wedding ring on a finger that was wrapped around the handle of the pistol. I'm not a gun guy, but that thing was an incredibly big pistol, like huge. And all I did was sort of zone out and look down the barrel for a few moments with this guy's screams ringing in my ears. It was only when he pushed it to my forehead that reality came back to me and hit me like a ton of bricks. I just remember shaking so hard that when the guy told me to get down on my knees, I could barely react. He screamed at me to get on my knees because I didn't deserve to die on my feet, and that line stuck with me even to this day. I've never been so scared in my entire life. If you notice, I haven't given my name or where this happened or when it happened. This is to give me enough anonymity to admit that just after I fell to my knees, and I mean fell to my knees, I just straight urinated my pants, which I didn't even know was really a thing. I mean, obviously I've heard about people being so scared they wet themselves, but I didn't think it could actually happen to people. But I suppose since I was full of booze and that large Coke, there was plenty in my bladder to void, and void my bladder I did. Somehow, I had found a way to make a terrible situation even worse. Not only did I think I was about to die in a parking lot, while a whole restaurant full of strangers looked on in horror, I was about to die soaked in my own urine, cowering and shaking, on my knees outside of a freaking Burger King. He starts shouting other stuff at this point too, but I can't quite remember that either. I was just waiting for the moment my light switched off, a feeling like I'd fallen asleep real fast that I'd never, ever wake up from. I remember trying to shout something myself, something about how, will someone please call the cops, or whatever, but fear is a powerful thing. I couldn't speak. I mean, it was like a nightmare come to life. One of those where you try to scream for help, but your voice just sort of dries up in your throat. The next thing I remember are my ears pricking up to the word cops being spoken by some bystander just out of my view. Then I hear the distinct voice of the ham beast repeating the word, only this time, it's not me that sounds scared, it's her. I feel the tip of the pistol leave my head, and by the time I summon the courage to look around again, I see the pair of them, ham beast and gun guy, screeching out of the parking lot in some battered old sedan, followed swiftly by the blaring sirens in the distance. It was only when I was giving my statement to the cops that I noticed my buddies were gone. And not only were they completely out of sight, so was the car. So I had to be driven home to my parents' house in a freaking cop car, which clued them into the fact that I had been drinking, which to them was far more worthy of their attention to the fact I'd almost just been shot in the Burger King parking lot. They tried to ground me for like a month, but they didn't need to enforce it. I was too shaken up to leave the house for the first week entirely. Just be careful who you're talking to or trying to be funny. You never know who's psycho enough to put a gun to your head.
Our official merch store is finally here. If you want to support more of our channel, check out our merch shop. The link is in the description down below. See you on the next video.